If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Night shift workers, what is the scariest, most paranormal thing you've experienced in the middle of the night? My husband works in a train yard at night and told me a story about a weird light several people saw one night in the wee hours. He said the light swiveled around like it was looking around, and it moved like it was galloping, and went through a vast wooded area much faster than any person could run. One other guy working in the yard got close enough to it and said it was a guy on his phone, but his description of the guy matched his own to an eerie degree. At one point, the light moved fluidly under a train car to the other side. We tried reasoning it through, and I think the nearest explanation is that it was a drone of some kind, but could someone really fly a drone through woods or under a train car without crashing? And why? Or maybe someone strapped a light to a coyote, will-o'-the-wisp? I work in a restaurant, and all the bakery people who stay late talk about the ghost of a little girl, but I didn't know this when I started. It was the middle of the day, but we were slow, so I was doing prep work by myself in the kitchen. I was at the prep table, kind of zoning out, listening to the distant music, when I felt someone right next to me. Like a sudden presence. Then, I swear to God, I heard, in a little girl's voice, the most innocent "Hi Josh. My name, how are you?" I even felt her breath. It was so real and vivid, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I started telling people about it and found out that lots of coworkers heard the same voice. From everyone's stories, she, the ghost girl, seems really nice, but it still sent chills down my spine. I was working EMS, and I was standing outside our station smoking a cigarette at about 03:00. Our garage and workshop were about 30 feet from me, and the garage door started to open. It got about halfway there and stopped. I opened the door into the station, thinking it was my partner ducking around, but he was still unconscious on the couch and hadn't moved from the position he assumed a few hours earlier. The door suddenly begins to close on its own, and I stare at the dilapidated building that held our ambulances and stock room. The heavy metal door next to the garage slowly opens, and I hear a voice yell, "Medic girl. Come here." From the direction of the garage. It was loud enough that my partner woke up and came outside, wondering who was yelling for me. It was a gruff masculine voice, and it called out again, "Medic girl. Come here." Both my partner and I heard it, and we just stared at each other. The inside of the garage was pitch black, so we couldn't see anyone. We called up PD and told them we thought there was someone ducking around in the garage, and a couple of officers came up. We all started walking towards the garage when the door, which was 3/4 of the way open, just slammed shut. We all turned around and ran. One of the officers called the K-9 officer, and he came down with his pup. They were going to do a search of the building, but the pup wouldn't go any closer to the building than about 10 feet away. The dog got close to the building, peed, and jerked backwards so hard on his lead that his head slipped out of his collar, and he ran back to the car, scratching to get back in. Not gonna lie, we ended up calling a priest because none of us wanted to deal with whatever was in that garage. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital. I would work on several different floors, wherever they needed extra staffing. So I was sent to work on the kids' floor, and I was unfamiliar with this set of patients. One little boy, 8 years old, needed to be constantly observed during his stay because he was aggressive. When he's sleeping, this usually just means the staff can pull up a chair and watch him from his doorway. This patient's sheet reported that he has auditory and visual hallucinations. He would wake up throughout the night frequently by sitting up and turning his head from side to side, scanning the room, and then he would look at me and say, "Oh, that was just you." He did this a few times, and I just chalked it all up to having psychotic symptoms. Then I saw a dark shadow was around the room, but the patient remained asleep. The next morning, he wakes up and sits at the table on the unit. I tried to start up some small talk and ask him how he slept, and he said tearfully, "I couldn't sleep because the shadow people wouldn't let me sleep." Then he stared off into space, and with a flat tone, he said, "Disappointment." Then looked at me and smiled. I was really weirded out by this whole shift and was telling one of the nurses who regularly works at the hospital, and she said, "Oh, is he sleeping in that room, isn't he?" "Yeah, that room is haunted. Most kids have trouble sleeping in that room." Then she told me about how the children's floor used to be the old electroconvulsive therapy unit, back when the technique had just been introduced and wasn't the most humane procedure. The building was built in the 1940s, and this era is known for inhumane treatment of patients. I used to work in a restaurant in high school. Next door was a rumored haunted house. They did ghost tours and the whole shebang. The night shift workers claimed the entire ground was haunted, including our restaurant. They claimed to see shadow people, Hat Man, and they also claimed stuff would get moved when no one was looking. I was pretty skeptical until someone freaked out over seeing a shadow person next to some pans and quit. We had to do a ton of extra work the next day because the restaurant was cheap and didn't want to hire more than 1 or 2 people for the night shift. I worked in national parks and also did some volunteer search and rescue. I guess I can talk about 2 of the worst things I ever saw in forestry. The latter one is scary but also deeply tragic. Spooky, I was on a multi-day off-road camping trip by myself in the wilderness. So technically, I was not working. I had found myself enjoying a night in the woods, slightly tipsy on wine. I settled in for the night in my SUV and awoke to yelling far in the distance. It wasn't screaming, nor was it singing. Something closer to chanting. I went to sleep nervous and with my army knife close. I woke up to someone knocking on my vehicle's glass. It was clearly human because they did the triple knock that all people do. As I came out of my covers to observe, I saw a person looking in the dark. I screamed something guttural, and they ran. I couldn't believe it. I was hours and hours from the nearest town, and if someone had driven in over the night, I would have heard the vehicle in the stillness. I was dumbfounded. I turned on my truck and stayed vigilant for a while. Nothing happened. The next morning, I went and found a new spot to park and set up camp. The second is, sadly, something that is very explainable but very sad to see. One blizzardy night, we hear that they are on the search for a woman who had disappeared from a group that was staying in a cluster of scenic cabins nearby. Not in the park, but very close to the border of it. But certainly a remote place. It took us about 2 hours to get to the cabins and talk to the people there. It was well under -17°C, around 0 in F, and covered in feet of snow. It turns out the people staying in the cabin were on psychedelics, and at some point the young woman got spoiled while under the influence of drugs and ran off outside. In regular clothes and sneakers. My partner and I in the search unit picked a search pattern and started looking for footprints. We found some, but then they broke off, and we lost the trail. After exactly 3 hours and 41 minutes, we found her clothes. And soon after, we found her. She was naked in her entirety. Including her shoes. She was barefoot. We found her sitting against a tree, and we rushed over. It was clear at this point that she was dead. At this time, local police were already on the scene, and after taking our statements, they left. It was a tough few nights after. Nightmares too. I was doing railway security near Aberdeen, Scotland. There was a stretch of road that only led to where we worked. For context, the site I was at was in a small forested area, and the only road leading into it. On a regular basis, the security there would only be about 1 person on the site at any time. The site's reason to exist was for vehicles to access the railways, would hear a car pull up and stop. So, we'd go down to the main gate and find no one there. Nothing, not a vehicle, no people, not a soul, was in sight. The first time it happened, it was me and the safety guy, Kenny, who were there. We heard a car pulling in, so I went to allow them in. No one was there. Kenny came with me, and because site rules said that I couldn't leave, he walked down the drive to the main road. No one was there either. It happened a lot, and nobody knew where the sound was coming from. There were no houses or farms nearby, no bothies, shelters for climbers and hill walkers, not even a hide for birdwatchers. But it was always the same sound, a car pulling in over gravel and stopping. My unit was conducting field exercises in the Ocala National Forest. We came across a bonefish altar, old melted candles, and whatnot. One of the guys stumbled over a rock. It was a very old grave marker. We found more, it was a child cemetery. Upon closer inspection, there appeared to be dried blood on the altar. It had a pentagram. A few years later, I found out it was the site of one of those reform schools from about 100 years ago that had been shut down due to all the abuse. I went on a date with a really hot goth chick who turned out to be a witch. She claimed that the whole area was sacred to them, that it's a real bad area to go camping, and that it's believed to be easier to pass through hell there. Anyway, I never went back. I was subbing in for a few overnights at another campus. The dorm was way smaller and quieter there, so I was alone. On my first shift, a mysterious native janitor comes out of nowhere and tells me about the ghost that roams the old library and that I'll see her in the window. She may also try to get into the dorm, so I should be careful if I hear noises down the hall. What a bunch of hooey. So 4 or 5 rolls around, I'm ready to doze off, it's still super dark out, and I keep an eye on the library windows to see if any weird ghosts are going to show up. And I hear a tapping or knocking sound from down the hall. You're right. Bang bang. Right, okay. It's the janitor who's come to scare me. I head out to investigate, and there's no one anywhere. I have a security feed from down the hall, outside, and in the back room. I roll it back, and there's no one anywhere, and there hasn't been for a long time. Outside the back room doors is a walkway and fresh snow, there are no tracks. Outside the windows are tall bushes. Weird, I'm sure it's just the pipes. The morning comes, and I laugh about it with one of the staff members that a janitor tried to scare me with ghost stories in the middle of the night. They're surprised Sue was in so early. I tell them about the guy who I had talked to. We don't have anyone overnight. Oh, come on, you're not going to pull that one on me. I roll the desk footage back to when he'd come by, and as we watch me look up at somebody talking to me, the feed glitches out, stutters, and is so scrambled you can't see anything. It comes back, I wave to someone, sit back down, and no one exits the frame or enters any of the other feeds. I used to do K-9 security for many years. I don't particularly believe in paranormal stuff, but I did get the heebie-jeebies a couple of times. There was one site I used to patrol with my dog a few nights a week. It was an old, historical farmhouse. From the main road, it was about a kilometer walk down a beat-up old dirt road with woods for a couple of 100 meters on either side. More of a path nowadays than a road. People talk of it being haunted, if you believe in that kind of thing. One night, it was really dark out. I can't remember if it was overcast or if there was no moon that night, but it was black. About 2/3 of the way to the farmhouse, my dog starts acting a little weird. I can feel him getting tense through the leash. He starts to let out really low growls every other step, and I can see his ears are twitching as my light swings back and forth. It's dark, but I'm sure his hackles are up. Maybe 100 meters or so after I started noticing him wigging out, he surfs out in front of me, which he only does if there is a perceived threat. He stays about 2 meters in front of me for a little bit, then just stops and starts growling at the darkness. Of course I am scanning with my light, but I can't see anything. After years of working with Brew, I have learned to trust him like I trust no one else. During one of my scans, I saw about 6 sets of eyes reflecting my light in the woods. I am certain it was coyotes, but damned if I didn't get the wicked shivers up and down. Brew and I retreated and went back to the car. I wrote it up as a clear patrol. Supernatural or not, I'm not letting my partner scrap it out with half a dozen ghost coyotes. I grew up as a hunter, tracker and fisherman. Never a day went by that I wasn't in the woods with my rifle or walking the edges of Saginaw Bay fishing. Not once in all my years has anything weird or creepy happened. My family was the go-to when people were lost either in the woods or in the water. We were quicker than the sheriff's department and knew the area better, so we thought we had a pretty good idea of what was and was not in the wilderness. I left for the military and came home a few years later, and late one night I was sitting in the dining room enjoying a glass of lemonade when I heard a metal crunching sound. I got up to investigate, and it was the family dog who was outside but was staring into the pasture and pressing so hard against the bottom of the screen door that he was buckling the aluminum panel. I turned on the spotlight we had mounted on a tower that shined into our pasture, and to this day I still don't know what it was, but when the light hit it, the thing went from a towering position to a crouching position behind weeds. I grabbed the nearest firearm, which was my father's side-by-side, pointed it at the eyeballs glowing back at me, and told whatever it was to come out or I would fire. I said it 3 times, and then I let it have it with both barrels. No noise, no screaming, or anything. It just turned and hauled ass. By now, my dad was up, rifle in hand, asking, "What's going on?" I told him, and we discussed looking during the daytime. After breakfast, we went out and found that where it was crouched, everything was mashed down flat. No blood, no hair, nothing but mashed down vegetation. So we followed the tracks to the state land and kept going until we ran into Ed, the only DNR officer for our area. I told him what happened, and he said we were the 5th people in a week who had the same experience. He was following tracks as well, which gave credence to what I witnessed. His tracks were from a farm 4 miles south of us. To this day, it has never been found, whatever it was. I was working night shift at UPS unload, and as a manager there, I had a radio with me to coordinate with the incoming trucks. The basic process, so there is a little context to my story, is that when a truck comes, I have to say which bay they came from so the monitors can determine the package's next destination. That being said, at that time, a colleague of mine used to bring breakfast. When she arrived, she would announce it on the radio so that we could all come down and partake in the feast. So as one of my trucks was coming into the bay, I heard it loud and clear that there was food, so I started to make my way down to the break room to get myself something to eat. But when I arrived, there was no one there. I got on the radio to ask about my colleague, and there was no answer. I called her on her cell phone, but there was no answer. At this point, I am thinking I am about to be the subject of someone's joke. Fast forward the story to the following. I found out that she had died in a car accident the same day I heard the announcement. That news, when it hit me, really started to scratch my head at what I heard. I am 100% sure I heard her voice on the radio that day, and no matter how many times I think about it, I am sure that it was her voice I heard. I believe there are things out there that we, as humans, are not meant to understand or will never understand. But this is something really interesting to me. Used to work in group homes for individuals with developmental disabilities. This home in particular was considered a high support home as the individuals there were relatively aggressive and their needs were mostly behavioral. The home itself was in the middle of nowhere, 15 minutes from the closest town, had no cell reception at all, and was surrounded by forest aside from a couple of other houses on the road. There were 2 overnight staff, usually one would be awake and one asleep and take turns. Anyway, the staff told me about one night when they heard noise coming from one of the people living in the house's room. I guess that person had decided to rip open a scab and use the blood to smear all over the walls of their room. One staff member went in to deal with the situation, and the individual said, "Don't worry, they're coming tonight." The other staff walked back out into the open concept living room, kitchen, and dining room to get the phone to call the on-call supervisor to let them know, since this required a lot of documentation and notifying the on-call. The staff noticed that the sliding door was now somehow ajar by about a foot, even though they had just been in that room and the door was closed and locked. When the other staff was walking towards it to close the door, they noticed a wolf, coyote, or coy wolf was slowly lurking on the porch towards the open door. They closed the door and ended up calling the police because they didn't know what the hell was going on. They had to clean all the bloody hand smears off the wall, and the individual didn't talk about it again. Just another overnight. It's more what I heard. I was living and working at an environmental education center near Navajo, Alabama. I had never lived in coal mining country before, so I was and am unfamiliar with much of the industrial process. This was near the Sipsey Wilderness area, so deep in the country that packs of feral dogs roamed uninhibited, attacking joggers and, I think, even killing a woman a couple years ago. The point is, it's about a 10-minute drive between each property line, with lots of leveled BLM forest. One night, the other staff and I were drinking around the fire, enjoying the summer night, when I slowly became aware of a rumbling in my bones. It was coming up from the ground through my camp chair. I got down and felt the dirt. It was like a distant earthquake. Then this distant roaring sound began to build. I cannot begin to describe how loud it was. It had to be at least 10 miles away due to the sizable property we lived and worked on, but it still felt too loud. It sounded like a dragon bellowing, or the mountain itself was screaming. There were multiple high pitches mixed into the din that sounded like demonic voices, and it just kept going. The air began to smell faintly of sulfur. I put my hands over my ears and ran inside. The mountain must have roared for a full 10 or 15 minutes, making it impossible to have conversation indoors or out, terrifying every animal on the property, and sending them into a blind panic. I even suspect we were being treated to some infrared too, because I broke out in a cold sweat and felt goosebumps and a deep sense of dread the whole time too. My coworkers from the area were nonplussed and explained that it was a normal coal mining noise, especially associated with mountaintop coal mining. Despite not being supernatural in nature, it's kind of haunted me ever since. When I was younger, I had an agency job cleaning buses at the local depot. The pay was crap, but it was a chill job where you were left to your own devices most of the time. The fleet was mostly modern, but there were a few ancient double-deckers kept around for less grueling duties. One of those buses, in particular, was haunted. The other cleaner and I would often hear people walking around the top deck when cleaning the bottom deck, and when you were up on the top deck, you'd sometimes hear footsteps slowly coming up the stairwell. They would always stop once they hit the top step. Some nights you'd hear the distinctive creaking sound of the destination blind being cranked from the driver's cabin too, but when you ran down, the blind or its handle hadn't moved an inch. One night, I was on my knees sweeping up broken glass with a dustpan and brush when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Behind the seat I was sweeping in front of, I could see a pair of legs. They were as solid as any other pair of legs, and I remember what they were wearing very clearly: green corduroy trousers, dark socks, and brown brogues. Then they began to bend. I was shitting myself and fell back with my eyes firmly closed. When I dared myself to reopen them, there was nothing there. I finished as quickly as possible and moved on to the next bus. Over a cup of tea, I told the other cleaner I'd seen something weird on that bus, and she just looked at me and went, "Were they green legs?" I never saw those legs again, but apparently she saw them a few times. Always just the legs. She never dared to look up and just looked elsewhere until they disappeared. I work private duty nursing. One of my patients lives out in the countryside in a small trailer. His street is the only residential one within a 1-mile radius. His room has a door in the back. Behind the trailer are nothing but shrubs and trees. Anyway, the family has like 3 dogs who don't really make that much noise. At first, they would bark at me, but they stopped once they got to know me. One night, it was like 3 a.m., and it was cold as duck. I started hearing the dogs bark like crazy. At first, I thought they saw a raccoon, a possum, or a tlacuache, so I thought nothing of it. Suddenly, I hear a knock on the door. I froze up, thinking, who could it be? I know it wasn't a family member since they were asleep and the dogs don't bark at them. I wait for a couple of seconds to think about what to do. I waited it out and didn't hear a second knock. After a while, the dogs stopped barking. About an hour later, I decided to look outside. I didn't see anybody there. I forgot about the whole thing for the night, thinking that maybe I just imagined someone knocking and the dogs really were just barking at some animal. My shift ends, and I go home to get some sleep. The next day, I'm at my patient's trailer again. The parents are about to go to sleep, so I give them a brief report. They are about to go to sleep when the mom turns around and says, "If someone knocks, don't open the door." I still work there. I was working at a copper mine in central Nevada. On a dark summer night, I was told to go down into the bottom of the pit we were digging to fuel our diesel shovel. For reference, it's about a 10-minute drive from the top of the pit to the bottom. Anyways, nobody was working in that pit, so I was the only person at the bottom of that pit while fueling. A few weeks earlier, we had dug up old mine shafts from the early 1900s. So the whole time I was fueling, I felt like I was being watched by someone or something. I was instinctually looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I'm not a small person. I'm 6 feet 5 inches and weigh about 300 pounds, but I felt something malicious was watching me the whole time. I used to work overnight alone in a group home to pay for college. Just me, 5 feet 3 inches female college student, and 12 kids between ages 12 and 18. There was one other staff member from day shift who is usually physically present for ratios, but they were asleep and locked in an upstairs bedroom. It was pretty quiet work most of the time, and I could get homework done during the wee hours, which was pretty handy. The house was donated to the agency because the family who had lived there didn't want it anymore. For some reason, my boss wouldn't go in. Part of my overnight routine was to go down to the basement and finish up any laundry the boys hadn't finished during the day. Frankly, just being involved with the laundry of 12 adolescent boys was scary enough to warrant a story here. Anyway, there was a walk-in supply cupboard down there where we kept detergent, etc., so sometimes I'd have to go in and pick up some soap, etc. The storage area had its own light, but the basement as a whole just had a single bulb hanging over the washers. So coming out of the comparatively bright storage into the dark basement was always a little creepy. Multiple times I saw what I can only say looked and felt like someone in white rushing past out of the corner of my eye while bending into the washers and fishing out clothes. It was particularly in one corner of the basement and had a very negative energy to it. Each time, I would flip out and book it upstairs, locking the basement behind me. I felt stupid about this but really couldn't stop myself. When I finally explained it to my boss, when I told him why I really wanted to stay out of the basement, he confirmed that the family had donated the house because their father had hanged himself from a beam in that exact corner. I worked the night shift as a CNA for a nursing facility. One resident we had was really mean and aggressive. One habit I hated was when the resident would scream mother at the top of their lungs over and over again. Fast forward 3 months, and I was training a new CNA about the night shift. We were in the other hallway as the resident, in another room, when we heard mother and a loud scream. We drop everything and run to the room, where the charge nurse and the nurse from the locked unit are already there. We were all freaked out, and the new CNA asked what that was. The resident who screamed mother had passed away 2 weeks earlier, and the room was still unoccupied. I confirmed with the nurses that they had heard the same thing we had. The scream was clear as day, and the fact that the CNA, who had never met this patient, heard it too. I used to work as a corrections officer. There was plenty of really creepy stuff that happened over those 5 years, but by far this is my favorite incident. I was assigned to the Singleman cell wing of the jail, which is basically solitary confinement for inmates who were being punished for breaking jail rules. So around 5 a.m., medical calls for all inmates that need medication to be escorted from my wing to medical to receive their meds. I pull out 2 guys, restrain them, and instruct them to face the wall and await the guard who will be escorting them. As the 3 of us are there, I begin to hear a woman crying. I was new to that jail and didn't think anything of it, and as I'm just listening to this woman cry, I slowly start to realize a few things. There are no females in this wing or in any wing where men are. The female wing is down the hall, sealed tight, with about 3 doors in between the hall and the actual wing. There is only about 2 other males in the wing who are asleep aside from us 3. I look up at the inmates and notice they have this kind of smile on their faces as they were watching me realize what was going on, and I ask them, "Do you guys hear that?" One of the inmates responds, "Almost every night, boss." The whole panic in the woods phenomenon is pretty scary in itself. I don't work in forests, but there is some land that has been in my family for generations. It's in the middle of nowhere, is super rocky, and is pretty much just solid wood. Not useful for stuff like building a house out there, starting a farm, or anything. One family member lives in a trailer out there, but we mostly just use it for hunting purposes. But since it has been in my family forever, everyone is super familiar with it and is pretty comfortable out there. My dad hunts out there all the time, without anything creepy happening. But one time he said he was in his tree stand out there and suddenly felt like something was watching him. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't like it. He did not even bother to gather his things before he fled the deer stand because he was so freaked out. He just grabbed his rifle and ran back to his truck. He moved his deer stand and no longer hunts in that portion of the woods. It was just weird because those woods are like a second home to my dad, and he's never scared out there. I worked security at a youth camp that was closing down. The layout was exactly like a prison. Barbed wire fences around the whole grounds. Big double gates that could only be opened from the control booth. I would be the only one there set up in the control room on the 3 to 11 p.m. shift. All I did was watch movies on my computer all night. The place was already creepy at first sight. The control room was an enclosed room with a huge steel door as the only way in. On many nights, I would hear someone trying to open the door, but the only way to open it was for me to buzz it open. Another night, while zoning out to clerks, I heard one of the doors in the hall open. I got up to look to catch the door closing, followed by a guy's voice that sounded like, "Hey." I just sat down and watched the movie. There was not much I could do. The weirdest thing that happened was hearing what sounded like a mop bucket being rolled across the floor when I'd get up. It happened a few more times until I went to check it out, and at the end of the hall, the mop bucket was sitting in the middle of the hall with the mop in it but was completely dry. I know for a fact that it wasn't there at the start of my shift. Other guards had some stories, too. Place is now a manufacturing plant for medical marijuana. I'm a night shift nurse at a semi-rural hospital. I've had 2 very creepy things happen. One of our patients had recently died, and his family members left after spending some time with his body. So we do the post-mortem care and take him down to the morgue. We didn't get any more admissions that night, so it was empty until we left. The thing is, the call bell from that room would keep ringing at random times. I went in there to make sure it was not under something. No one was messing with it because the room was right across the nurse's station. I still can't explain that. Tonight I'm working. One of my patients is very ill, and she was yelling out because she said someone was looking at her from the anteroom. The anteroom is a little room next to isolation rooms where we can put on our isolation gowns or gear. It's typically used for TB patients if we have any and serves as a little gateway to negative pressure rooms so the infection stays in the room. Anyhow, I kind of figured it was maybe her dementia or something. The thing is, I didn't know until later that the previous night, her daughter also saw someone looking in from the anteroom. Her daughter was serious as well. We've been keeping a close eye on my patient because we're pretty sure she's not going to make it through the night. Every time we go in there, other nurses or aides get a deep chill in their spine. I'm so glad I didn't come in tonight. I used to work for a very major company I'm not going to say the name of. To put it in perspective, when they moved into the area with their factory and plant, they took up miles of land for the massive main building, the auxiliary buildings surrounding them, and the roads paved just for their new base of operations. They employed thousands just in this area. Anyway, I needed a job at the time, and they hired me for basic security. I meant that as the actual term. There were levels of security guards here, and I was just a basic one. I was basically the walking security camera that called the more proficient security guards if I saw shit. Well, I worked from 9:30 p.m. to 7:45 a.m. at various points. I was sitting in a booth, and at other points, I was walking around. The weekend before Thanksgiving, I remember being on shift and having a night that I quit and found a new job because of. So I'm patrolling around the perimeter of one of the main buildings. There are night shift workers inside, and this plant operates 24/7. I hear them working away as usual. My walkie-talkie goes off, though, and someone other than my main shift boss tells me to go check out behind an auxiliary building. Now I only divert, usually when my shift boss tells me to. I didn't recognize this voice. So I call back, asking for them to ask what's up. My actual shift boss replies this time, asking me what I'm talking about, and I tell him someone said to check the auxiliary building. He said no one said that and to stay in my patrol area. I think I'm being bamboozled, but I stay and keep patrolling. About an hour later, the same message comes back, and someone tells me that I need to go check out the field behind the auxiliary building. I make the same call back, and my boss says the same thing. Apparently, I'm the only one hearing it. Eventually, shifts change. My boss leaves 2 hours before I do, and there's a 40-minute gap between shift bosses sometimes if, for whatever reason, they take a while switching. During that gap, the voice comes back on my channel, telling me to go to the auxiliary building again. The O building is empty during the night. It's away from the main plant and faces the woods surrounding the land. Just for reference. I ignore it and wait for my main shift manager. I call a few other guards, though, and ask if anyone has seen anything near the O building, and I tell them what I've been hearing. They all deny hearing anything. One agrees to go look since they're nearby, though. Much closer than me. Eventually, he says nothing is up near the building, all is well. I finish my shift and start driving away from the plant. I pass by the auxiliary building on the way out and, just out of curiosity, glance over at it. There are like 15 people standing next to the tree line of the woods behind the O building, all wearing red from head to toe. I was contracted and at will, and I told my boss I couldn't continue. I was too spooked. It turns out the same guard who checked for me quit shortly after that. So I work in the middle of the Navajo Nation at a power plant, and naturally, it's kind of creepy driving to work at midnight. It was raining, and I was driving down the highway after leaving a gas station. Jamming to some Ashley by Escape the Fate, my Spotify playlist is a very confusing place. I see headlights heading right at me. Me being me, I slam it. Going about 75 when suddenly the headlights veer off into the desert. But they were headlights, they were two obs, emitting only light off themselves and not where they were headed. They shot into the desert, and I drove the rest of the way to work with my jaw dropping. Another night, I was driving to work. I was about a quarter mile from the entrance to the power plant. There was a car being driven by me, and we were going uphill, doing about 40. This blue orb comes out of the desert and goes through my car. As I made contact, all my gauges dropped to 0. Battery, gas, RMP, mile per hour, temperature, and oil, everything dropped. For what seemed like minutes, then suddenly everything came back up and I drove to work. I told a coworker, and he said he saw me coming up the hill, but my lights went out. And the last light story, I was driving to work just the other day. When you're coming up the hill to work, you can see the long stretch of highway, which is 5 miles from town. As I'm starting the hill climb, I notice a car coming up pretty fast behind me. It got pretty close. Then the right light went out, then the left. Which would have meant it turned to the right. But if it had taken a right, it would have gone straight into the desert. Now that the building I work in is also part of the warehouse, a few people have died here. One night I was on my lunch break. 15 minutes is more of a potty break. I was walking down the corridor and just past the women's bathroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a black figure standing in the doorway. My heart stops, but I keep walking. I know it's either my imagination or I walk into the men's room, drop my towel, and start pooping. About 30 seconds into my poop, the door opens. It's 4 a.m., the warehouse is closed until 7 a.m., and I am the only person back there. I hear footsteps walking and an overwhelming smell of spicy men's cologne with cigarettes. The footsteps got closer and stopped at the shower. Suddenly, the lights went out. I pinched my turd, pulled everything up, and didn't even tuck in my shirt. I booked it out of there and finished my poop in the bathroom where I work. I didn't go back there for a few months, now I poop back there every day and just keep a flashlight with me. I was a security guard at a scrap yard. One day I went into the small management building to do my business. We had a small bridge with a scale. Cars would drive in, get weighed, then drive out and get weighed again to see how much scrap was removed. Of note, this was during the Slenderman craze, and someone had drawn his symbol all over the place, most likely bored kids with their parents looking through the scrap when no one was looking or people that came onto the site when there was no one there. Yes, even though I worked security, I'd get there after the crew had left for the day and leave before they arrived. I was a security guard at a scrap yard. One day I went into the building to do my business. We had a small bridge with a scale. Cars would drive in, get weighed, then drive out and get weighed again to see how much scrap was removed. Anyway, after I'd cleaned up, I noticed the scale was going from 0 to 200 pounds. I looked out the window, this yard was in a wooded area, and the trees weren't moving an inch, so it wasn't the wind. Then I heard a roaring sound. Even though this was a wooded area, we were still developed enough for there to be no animals that could make that sound. I spent the rest of the shift in my car, the fence gate opened, prepared to get out if needed. I was working night shift on a medicine floor, and at around 5 a.m., we wake our patients up briefly to change their diapers for those who are incontinent. I woke up one of my old ladies, and she immediately pointed to the area beside me and asked me, "Who's that beside you?" I tell her there's no one beside her, and I'm here to change her. She agrees but still points to the same area and asks me, "Are you sure no one's there?" Someone's climbing the wall. They have long black hair covering their faces, and they're just climbing. I laugh it off to her and tell her again that there's no one there and it's just the curtain. But who am I kidding? I was trying to convince myself. I finished quickly, turned off the lights, and bolted out of there. On another occasion, also night shift, I was working with another nurse during the time I was on float staff. We heard something that sounded like a patient falling. We quickly scan all our rooms and look for anything on the floor in our patients' rooms, but there's nothing. We start looking at empty rooms, and in the middle of one of them, there's just a 1-liter bag of 4 fluids in the middle of the room. We think nothing of it and pick it up. 30 minutes later, the call bell goes off in that room, but there's no patient. We pick up and hang up the phone, but we're creeped out. When the other nurses returned from break, they told us the patient there had passed earlier that day. I was working on a mine site that was shut down from production because the resource we were mining dropped steeply in price. On night shift, there were 2 guys in the plant, a guy running the powerhouse, all about 1 kilometer away, me, security/medic, and the only lady, of course, all alone in the gatehouse. The site itself was about 1.5 hours from civilization, and even when I was on day shift, it gave me the heebie-jeebies. My desk has a window that has a direct view down the access road to the site, and as I'm sitting on my computer, I see movement out of the corner of my eye. There is a man walking down the access road towards the gatehouse at AM. My spidey sense is screaming at me, but I don't falter. I email the powerhouse and advise that I have someone at the gate and that they can call in and check on me in 5 minutes, and I open the service window to talk to my visitor. As he gets about 20 meters from the gatehouse, he vanishes. I spit my pants. I lock all the things and call the plant, asking one of the guys to come over but not telling him why. He arrives and can clearly see I have shaken. I tell him what I have just seen. "Oh, that's just Dave." "Dave? Who the duck is Dave?" "He is that bikey bloke that died in the crib room. Didn't anyone tell you the story?" Well, no, they hadn't, and assuming he was just trying to freak me out, I conducted a little Google investigation, and sure enough, a man was shot nearby and was brought by his friends to the site for help. He died in the crib room. For the uninitiated, the crib room is the lunch room. So now I don't pee for my whole 12-hour shift, obviously, and I close all the blinds. On my next swing, this was a fly-in, fly-out job. I come in on day shift and am doing the rosters. The night shift medic tells me in no uncertain terms, "Don't ever put me on nights here again." I refuse to do them. He wouldn't tell me why. "It's okay, mate, I saw him too, just shut the blinds from now on." I used to work overnights doing phone support. Let me just say that the area in general we worked in has always had a weird vibe to it, stuff that doesn't seem exactly out of place but is just abnormal in a way that's difficult to explain. To make matters worse, there's a cemetery about a mile up the road, and it can kind of get in your head when you're thinking about it. Off the top of my head, I've experienced weird lights in the sky. Not your typical that might be an airplane, but as in, when coworkers and I would be outside and see a light off in the distance hovering, it would move up vertically, make a sudden and quick horizontal downward slope, go up vertically again, and take off. Strange lights in the building across the street from us, big building, not sure how many stories, but very tall. Was abandoned up until this year, for maybe 4 years or so. Occasionally, lights would come on, go off, and come on again. You could see what looked like people roaming around with flashlights. I would hear singing late at night outside, all throughout the year. Definitely a woman's voice. I couldn't make out what was being sung and could never find out where it was coming from. Coworker doppelgangers. Stones would be thrown at us from seemingly nowhere. There is like a very small little pond next to the building, surrounded entirely by a fence and high grass. Sometimes it sounded like something massive had jumped inside of it, followed by heavy sounding steps. I used to work on a surgical ward that was a ward for returning POWs after Vietnam. One side of the ward was used as a same-day surgery unit, and the other half was an inpatient ward. At night, the same-day surgery side was locked up, and no one was over there. Several times, between 1 to 4 a.m., the same-day side would have patient call buttons go off. Random times, but usually the same 3 out of 5 rooms and in the same beds. Frequently, our storage room, not used for patient care in years, would have the highest number of call buttons going off. It would happen several times per night. The hospital admissions staff came over and asked why there were people moaning in the rooms next door. When they were told there were no patients in that room and no one had used that room in years, they got creeped out and would run past that room. Watching all this gave me an idea. One night, the call buttons went off 7 or 8 times in a row. I was tired of getting the keys and going into the same creepy, dark room several times in this one night. I stood near an empty bed and told the air that I was giving the patient something for pain. Then I said that I hoped they felt better, said good night, locked the door, and went back to the other side of the ward. It quit going off that night after that. I knew others had this same issue and told them to try the pain medication trick. Eventually, we would give the patients pain medication on the first call, and it would be quiet for the rest of the night. Other times we wouldn't do it, and the button would go off multiple times a night. I don't know if it was truly ghosts or an electrical glitch. But it only happened at night. Our ward also had wheelchair wheels spin in place and doors and chairs move on their own. It was definitely creepy at night. When I was a student nurse, I was working at an assisted living facility. On one late shift, I was doing my final rounds before leaving for the night. I enter the room of one of the female residents, and she's sitting on her bed, staring at the wall. I encourage her to get into bed, and she looks at me and states she doesn't want to go to sleep because the man will just wake her up anyway. I ask her what she means, and she explains that at night, a man walks down the corridor and comes into her room. She tells me that he stands in her room and stares at her. I reassure her that she's safe, and as it's a secure facility, there's no one here that shouldn't be. I help her into bed and then leave. Fast forward to a few nights later, and I learn that this resident is still not sleeping at night because of this man who wakes her up. Towards the end of my shift, around 11 p.m., I'm doing my rounds again, and I hear the same resident call out. I rush to her room, thinking she has fallen, and find her sitting on her bed. She tells me the man has just been in her room again. I ask her to describe the man. We had male nurses and carers on site at the time. I thought she may have seen one of them walk past her room, and she describes an older man with gray hair and a big scar on his cheek. I sit with her until she settles, then I leave. The next day, I talk with one of the nurses about the incident the night before and explain how she described the man. When I mention the scar, the nurse stops and looks at me. She states that the man in the room before her had a scar on his cheek and died in his sleep. She explains that the current resident would not have met the gentleman, as he died 2 weeks prior to her arriving at the facility. She then goes on to say that when he was alive, he would just wander the corridors. This freaked me out a bit, as part of my job was essentially to walk around the facility in the dark, checking on residents. A few nights later, she stopped complaining about the man in her room.